The letter hit the marble floor before anyone could stop it. Lady Corabel Ashton snatched it up herself, fingers shaking inside her white gloves, eyes moving fast across words that carved through her chest like cold iron. The Duke of Ashverne had chosen another woman. The wedding date was sealed, the chapel was booked, and she, the woman who had nursed him back from the edge of death, who had kept his secrets, carried his grief, and loved him in silence for 4 long years, was simply expected to show up, bow gracefully, and step aside. So she did exactly that. She ordered a gown. She pinned her hair. She lifted her chin so high it ached. And on the morning of the grandest wedding Ashverne had seen in a generation, Lady Corabel walked through those cathedral doors not as a guest of honor, not as a woman scorned, but as someone who had already said goodbye inside her own heart. The hall was breathtaking, hundreds of candles, silk draped from every arch, lords and ladies packed into every polished pew, whispering, watching, waiting. Corabel found her seat near the back. She folded her hands. She breathed slowly. She told herself she was ready. Then the doors opened, and the new Duchess appeared, and every single eye in that hall turned, including the Duke's. But the Duke of Ashverne was not looking at his bride. He was looking at Corabel, and the expression on his face was not the calm, composed look of a man stepping into his future. It was the look of a man watching something irreplaceable walk out of his life forever, and only just realizing it. The music played. The Duchess moved forward. The priest opened his book, and then the Duke raised one hand and said, quietly but clearly, so that every person in that hall could hear it, "Stop." Now the question I want to leave with you is this. If the person you loved most said nothing for years, but stopped everything at the very last second, would that be enough for you? Would you stay? Drop your answer in the comments. Tell us where you are watching from. And if this story is already pulling at your heart, please hit the subscribe button right now. You do not want to miss what happens next. The morning of the wedding arrived like a sentence being read aloud in court. Cold. Final. Impossible to argue with. Lady Corabel Ashton had not slept. She had sat at the edge of her bed in Ashverne's guest wing from the moment the clock struck 2, watching the candle beside her burn itself down to nothing, thinking about all the things she should have said 3 years ago when she still had the chance. The words had been there, right there, sitting at the back of her throat every single evening they had spent together in the library. Every morning he had found her walking the East Gardens alone, every quiet supper they had shared when the rest of the house had gone to sleep. She had never said them. And now a woman named Lady Prudence Galton was in the bridal chamber 2 floors above her, being dressed and powdered and perfumed for the man Corabel had quietly, hopelessly, completely loved since the day she had pulled him back from the worst moment of his life. She stood up from the bed, walked to the mirror, and looked at herself for a long time. She was not plain. She had never been plain. But she was not the daughter of an earl either. She was not connected to 3 generations of political alliance, the way Prudence Galton was. She was simply the daughter of a modest but respected baron, a woman who had arrived at Ashverne 3 years ago as a companion to the Duke's ailing mother, and had somehow, without planning it, without wanting it to happen, become the person the Duke of Ashverne trusted more than anyone else in his life. His name was Roland Ashverne, Duke of Ashverne, 31 years old, broad-shouldered and serious-faced, with dark eyes that held more feeling than he ever allowed himself to speak aloud. He had inherited the dukedom at 26 after his father's sudden death, and had spent the years since running the estate, managing Parliament obligations, and carrying a quiet heaviness that never quite left his expression, even when he smiled. Corabel had seen him smile, though, genuinely, properly smile, the kind that reached his eyes and softened the hard line of his jaw. She had seen it more than anyone else had. She knew this because his own sister, Lady Petra Ashfern, had told her so once, standing in the rose garden with a look on her face that said far more than her words did. "He only laughs like that when you are in the room," Petra had said. "I do not think he knows it yet." Corabel had said nothing back. She had only looked at the roses. That had been 8 months ago. Now Petra was downstairs in the grand hall, supervising flower arrangements and pretending she was perfectly content with her brother's choice of bride, and Corabel was in front of this mirror, pinning her hair with hands that would not stop trembling. She pinned the last strand. They smoothed the front of her gown, exhaled slowly through her nose. She was going to attend this wedding. She was going to sit in a pew near the back and watch Roland Ashfern take Prudence Galton as his wife. And then, before the reception began, she was going to slip away quietly, step into the waiting carriage she had already arranged, and leave Ashfern behind forever. She had already packed her trunk. She had already written to her aunt in Bath. She had already said the kind of goodbye to this house that nobody else could see, touching the door frame of the library as she passed it last night, pausing at the top of the east staircase, standing in the garden in the dark for 10 full minutes, and letting herself feel every single thing she had been holding back for 3 years. She was done now. She was ready, or so she told herself. But the hall was already full by the time she came downstairs. Every great name in English society had turned out for this wedding. The Hartons, the Prescott family, Lord Dunwall and his 3 unmarried daughters, Countess Fairbridge, who had travelled from Edinburgh specifically for this event and made sure everyone knew it, Baron Selwick with his new young wife on his arm, the Marchioness of Trenthorn, ancient and sharp-eyed, sat near the front as though she had personally organised the entire ceremony. Even Lord Carew, who never attended anything, had arrived, standing near the entrance with a glass of something already in his hand, and his usual expression of bored amusement on his face. Corabel moved through the crowd quietly, nodding to the faces she recognized, avoiding the ones she knew would try to pull her into conversation. She found a seat in the 3rd row from the back, smoothed her skirt, folded her hands in her lap, and fixed her gaze on the altar. The flowers were beautiful, white and cream and gold. The chapel attached to Ashfern Manor was old, built in the time of the first Duke, with high stone walls and tall windows that let in columns of pale winter light. It smelled of candle wax and cold stone, and something sweet she could not name. She thought about Roland in this chapel as a boy. She had heard the story from his mother before the Duchess passed. How he used to sneak in here on Sunday mornings before the sermon and sit alone for an hour in the silence, just thinking. His mother had said he was the most interior child she had ever raised, felt everything deeply and showed almost nothing. Corabel believed it. She had seen what he hid. For 3 years ago, 6 weeks after she had arrived at Ashfern, Roland's younger brother Alden had died in a riding accident on the North Field. He had been 22, bright and reckless and adored by the entire estate. His death had broken something in the household that had never fully healed. The staff had gone quiet. The Duchess had taken to her bed, and Roland had simply continued, walking through the days with his jaw set and his eyes emptied of something she could not name. Everyone had given him space. Corabel had given him tea. It was not a grand gesture. It was barely anything at all. She had simply brought a tray to the study, where he had locked himself for 3 days, knocked on the door, and when he had not answered, she had set it on the floor outside and said through the wood, "You do not have to talk. You do not have to open the door. I just did not want you to be without something warm." He had opened the door. He had looked at her with those dark eyes, full of something cracked open and raw. And then he had taken the tray and said nothing, but he had left the door open, and she had sat in the chair in the hallway outside the study for 2 hours reading a book she was not truly reading while he sat inside in the silence. And somehow, without either of them deciding it, that had been the beginning of everything. They had spent the following year in a kind of friendship that had no proper name in the language of society. It was too close to be a polite acquaintance. It was not allowed to be anything else. She was a companion. He was a duke. The distance between those two things was not just social, it was structural, or built into the very bones of the world they lived in. But they had found a way to exist inside the gap. Conversations in the library that started at 8 and ran past midnight. Walks through the East Garden that were supposed to last 20 minutes and stretched to an hour. Notes left on books. Small things noticed and remembered. The way he always made sure the fire in whatever room she was sitting in was properly stoked before he left it. The way she always had the correct answer ready for whatever political problem he was turning over in his mind before he had finished asking the question. It had been the closest thing to love that either of them had ever allowed themselves. And then the letters had started arriving from London. And then Lord Galton had written to Roland about his daughter. And then Roland had gone quiet in a different way, a way that shut Corabelle out instead of letting her in. And she had understood, the way you understand something terrible that you have been quietly preparing for, that the gap between companion and Duchess was one he was not going to cross. She had not cried. She had not said a single word about it. She had simply begun, slowly and methodically, to pull herself back. Less time in the library, shorter walks, fewer notes. She had made herself smaller inside Ashfern, so that by the time Prudence Galton arrived for the formal introduction 3 months ago, Corabelle was practically invisible. Prudence was everything the situation required her to be: elegant, accomplished, genuinely lovely in the way that portraits are lovely, composed and deliberate and designed to impress. She had looked at Ashfern Manor the way someone looks at a place they are already planning to rearrange. She had been perfectly gracious to Corabelle, which was somehow the most painful part. Roland had looked at Corabelle exactly once during Prudence's visit. Once, across the length of the drawing room, for just a moment before he looked away. That single look had cost Corabelle 3 nights of sleep. She was thinking about that look now, sitting in the pew with her hands folded and the organ beginning its low, rolling, opening chords, when she became aware of a presence beside her. She turned. Lord Carew had left his position near the entrance and was now sliding into the seat directly next to her, with the unhurried ease of a man who did exactly as he pleased at all times. His name was Dorian Carew, second son of the late Earl of Carew, though 34 years old, possessed of a reputation so complicated that half of London found him charming, and the other half found him dangerous, often the same people on different days. He and Roland had been at school together, and had maintained, against all logic, a genuine friendship across 20 years of very different lives. He had also, for reasons Corabelle had never fully understood, been paying close attention to her since the day they had first met at a dinner party 2 years ago. "You are sitting very far back," he said, without greeting her. "I prefer it," she said. "I know you do." He looked at the altar. I also know you have a trunk packed and a carriage waiting." She turned to look at him sharply. He met her gaze with eyes that were lighter than Roland's, grey-green and difficult to read, and a slight smile that held something that was not quite amusing. "Roland told me." "Roland does not know about the carriage." "No," Dorian said, "but he knows about the trunk. Your maid told his valet told him, and Roland told me at 7 this morning, while he was standing in his dressing room, looking like a man walking to his own execution." Corabel said nothing. "He asked me," Dorian continued, "to make sure you did not leave before the reception." "He asked you that?" "He did." "On the morning of his wedding to another woman?" "Yes." The organ swelled. The doors at the far end of the chapel opened. Every head in the room turned. Prudence Galton appeared in the doorway on her father's arm, composed and radiant, and entirely certain of her place in this moment. Corabel faced forward. She made herself look, or she made herself breathe. She felt Dorian watching her from the side, and she hated that he could see what she was working so hard to hide, and she hated even more that Roland, somewhere up at that altar, apparently knew she had been planning to leave, and his response had been to send his most perceptive friend to sit beside her and keep her in place. What was she supposed to do with that? What was she supposed to feel? Prudence reached the altar. Lord Galton placed her hand in Roland's. The priest opened his book. Roland did not look at his bride. He looked at the floor, and Corabel, despite every wall she had built, despite every careful preparation she had made, felt her heart tear directly down the middle. The priest began to speak. The chapel was completely silent, except for his voice and the soft movement of candle flame. And then Roland Ashverne raised his head. Not toward the priest, not toward Prudence, not toward the watching crowd of England's finest, all of them leaning slightly forward with the particular hunger of people witnessing something historic. He raised his head and looked directly at Corabel. The look lasted only 4 seconds, but in those 4 seconds she saw everything he had never said. Every moment in the library, every walk in the garden, every note in every book, every fire he had quietly made sure was burning before he left a room. All of it, compressed into one look, offered across the full length of that chapel, with 300 people between them, and a bride standing at his side. The priest continued speaking. Roland looked away. Corabel pressed her hands together in her lap until her knuckles ached. Dorian, beside her, was very still. The ceremony moved forward. The words were spoken. The priest reached the part of the service that required the declaration of intent, and he paused in the way priests pause at that moment, letting the weight of it settle over the room. "If anyone present knows of any lawful reason why these two should not be joined," the priest said, in the formal language of the rite, "let them speak now." No one spoke. The room was absolutely silent. And then Roland turned his head slowly away from the priest, away from Prudence, away from Lord Galton and the Marchioness of Trenthorn, and everyone else gathered in witness, and he looked at Corabel one more time. This time the look was different. This time it was a question. And Dorian Carew, seated quietly beside her, leaned an inch in her direction and said, barely above a breath, "He is waiting." Corabel's whole body went still. The silence stretched. The priest cleared his throat softly, and Roland said, in a voice that was quiet but perfectly clear, that carried to every corner of that stone chapel without effort, "Stop." The word fell like a stone into still water. Prudence turned to look at him. Lord Galton took a step forward. The Marchioness of Trenthorn made a sound that was not quite a gasp, and Roland Ashfern, Duke of Ashfern, straightened to his full height, turned from the altar, and began walking directly down the aisle toward the third row from the back. Toward Corabel. The crowd parted around his path like water. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. 300 people sat in suspended, collective shock as the Duke of Ashfern walked away from his own wedding with the kind of total, but unhurried certainty that made every person in the room understand, without needing to be told, that he was not stopping. He reached her pew. He stopped. He looked at her, and up close, with nothing between them, the look was almost unbearable. "I have made," he said quietly, "a catastrophic mistake." Corabel stared at him. "I have been making it for 3 years," he said, "and I am not willing to finish making it today." Behind him, Prudence Galton had not moved from the altar. Lord Galton's face had gone the deep red of a man working very hard not to say something explosive. Lady Petra Ashfern, standing near the front, had both hands pressed over her mouth. Dorian Carew leaned back in the pew with the expression of a man watching something he had been expecting for a very long time. "Roland," Corabel said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "There are 300 people in this chapel." "I know," he said. "Prudence is standing at the altar." "I know that too. You cannot simply—" "I can," he said. "I am doing it." He reached down and took her hand from her lap. Not gently, not tentatively, firmly. The way you take hold of something you are absolutely certain belongs to you, and you are done pretending otherwise. And the entire chapel erupted. Lord Galton's voice rose above the noise first, demanding, furious, calling for order, calling for explanation, calling on Roland to return to that altar immediately. The Marchioness of Trenthorn had actually risen from her seat. 3 different women near the front had fainted, or were pretending to. Baron Selwick's new young wife was gripping his arm so hard he winced. And Prudence had still not moved. She stood at the altar with her father's rage boiling around her, and her wedding dissolving in real time. And she looked not devastated, not humiliated, but something else entirely. She looked, Corabel realized with a shock of clarity, almost relieved. But there was no time to examine that, because Roland was still holding her hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that asked a question more clearly than words could manage, and every nerve in her body was responding to it in ways she had been suppressing for 3 years. And somewhere in the chaos behind him, Dorian Carew had stood up and was doing something useful that she would have to thank him for later. "I need you," Roland said, under the noise, just for her, "to tell me it is not too late." Corabel looked at him for a long moment. 3 years of silence, 3 years of careful distance, 3 years of folded hands and bitten back words and packed trunks and carriages waiting in the drive. "It is very nearly too late," she said. "But not quite?" he asked. She looked at the hand holding hers. She looked at his face. She looked at the chapel in chaos behind him. The 300 witnesses, the altar, the priest with his book still open, Petra with her hands over her mouth and tears streaming, Dorian managing Lord Galton with the smooth efficiency of a diplomat, Prudence standing alone in a silence of her own making. "Not quite," Corabel said. And Roland Ashfern, for the first time in 3 years, smiled in a way that reached his eyes. The chapel did not calm down on its own. It took Dorian Carew, 3 senior footmen, and the combined authority of Lady Petra Ashfern, moving through the crowd like a woman who had personally decided that hysteria was not going to happen in her family's chapel. Not today. Not while she was standing in it. Lord Galton was still shouting. He was a large man, broad and red-faced, with the kind of voice that had spent 40 years being obeyed in every room it entered. He was not accustomed to being ignored. He was absolutely not accustomed to watching a duke walk away from his daughter at the altar in front of 300 witnesses, and the sound coming out of him now was less speech and more the noise a man makes when the entire architecture of his plans collapses at once. "Ashvern!" he bellowed, for the 4th time. "You will return to this altar. You will fulfill the terms of this arrangement. I have witnesses, but I have contracts. I have the word of a duke, which I was led to believe meant something in this country." Roland did not turn around. He was still standing at Corabel's pew, still holding her hand, and he was looking at her with an expression that said very clearly that Lord Galton's voice, at this particular moment, was reaching him from somewhere very far away. "We need to move," Corabel said quietly. "Yes," Roland agreed. "Now," she said, "before Lord Galton reaches you." Roland glanced back over his shoulder. Lord Galton had pushed past 2 rows of stunned guests and was moving down the aisle with the momentum of a man who had decided that physical interception was the next logical step. Dorian had stepped into his path, which was slowing him, but not by much. Dorian was good at many things, but he was not quite as large as Lord Galton, and negotiation only worked on people who were willing to be negotiated with. Roland turned back to Corabel. "The side door," he said, "behind the choir stalls." She knew the one. She had used it herself on 2 occasions when she had needed to leave the chapel quietly without crossing the main hall. She nodded once, and Roland kept hold of her hand and moved, guiding her out of the pew and along the narrow side passage that ran behind the last 3 rows of seating, away from the chaos in the main body of the chapel. They reached the side door. Roland pushed it open. Cold winter air hit them both at once, sharp and clean, after the heat of 300 bodies packed into a stone room. They stepped out into the narrow courtyard that ran along the chapel's north wall. The door swung shut behind them, muffling the noise inside to a dull roar. For a moment they just stood there, both of them breathing. Then Corabel pulled her hand free of his. Not angrily, not dramatically. She simply needed it back. She needed to be able to think, and she could not think clearly while his hand was holding hers, because the feeling of it was doing something to her chest that made careful thought nearly impossible. "You stopped your own wedding," she said. "I did," Roland said, "in front of 300 people." "Yes, including the Marchioness of Trenthorn." "I am aware of who was in the room, Corabel." She turned to look at him fully. He was still in his wedding clothes, perfectly fitted, perfectly pressed. The kind of clothing that had been made specifically for this day, for this ceremony, for the moment he was supposed to become a husband to someone else. He looked, she thought, slightly stunned by his own actions, the way a person looks when they have done something they knew they were going to do, but had not quite prepared themselves for the reality of having done it. "Why?" she asked. Not unkindly. Genuinely. He looked at her for a moment. "You are going to leave." "That is not an answer to the question I asked." "It is the only answer I have that is honest," he said. "I was standing at that altar, and I knew you had a carriage waiting, and I thought about you getting into it, and I thought about watching Ashvern become a place you used to live, and I could not do it. I could not say the words and let you go at the same time." Corabel was quiet for a moment. The cold was settling around them. Somewhere inside the chapel, Lord Galton was still audible even through the stone wall. "You had months," she said. "You had years, Roland. You had every evening in the library, and every morning in the garden, and every quiet supper, and every moment in between, and you said nothing. You chose her. You signed the contracts. You let the invitations go out to 300 people. And now, at the very last possible second, you stop the ceremony and take my hand and look at me like that. And I am supposed to. She stopped herself. Roland waited. He did not try to fill the silence. He had always understood when she needed space to finish a thought, and he gave it to her now. I am supposed to what? She said, or more quietly. Simply be grateful? Simply say yes and let everything else dissolve? No, he said. You are supposed to be furious with me. You have every right to be. I am furious with you. I know. I packed a trunk, Roland. I wrote to my aunt. I said goodbye to this house in the dark last night, because I was so certain that today was the end of everything. I know that too. Then why did you wait? Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough that she had to press her lips together for a moment before she could continue. Why did you wait until she was standing at the altar? Why did you let it go so far? Roland was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, and the careful composure he usually carried had thinned enough that she could see directly underneath it. Was because I was afraid, he said. Not of what people would say. Not of Lord Galton. Not of the contracts or the scandal or the Marchioness of Trenthorn's opinion, which I can assure you I care very little about at the best of times. He paused. I was afraid of you, of what you would say if I told you, of what it would mean if I told you and you did not feel the same, and I had destroyed everything between us by saying the wrong thing and lost even what we had. Corabel stared at him. I know that is cowardly, he said. I know it cost you more than it cost me. I know you were the one sitting in that chapel this morning, trying to be dignified about something that was not dignified at all. I know what I put you through, and I am not asking you to forgive it quickly. But I am asking you to let me try to be worth forgiving. The courtyard was very still. Inside the chapel the noise had shifted. It sounded less like chaos now, and more like the organized movement of people being managed out of a space by someone efficient. Dorian, probably. Or Petra. Possibly both. Corabel looked at Roland for a long time. Then she said, What about Prudence? Something moved across his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something more complicated. Prudence deserves better than a husband who loves someone else, he said. She always did. I should have seen that sooner. She looked relieved, Corabel said, when you walked away. She looked almost relieved. Roland nodded slowly. There is something you do not know about Prudence. What do you mean? Before he could answer, the side door opened, and Petra Ashfern stepped through it, closing it firmly behind her. She was composed in the way that only people who have been managing social disasters for years can be composed, her expression perfectly arranged, her hands folded, her eyes moving between her brother and Corabel, with the sharp assessment of someone rapidly calculating 17 different things at once. Lord Galton has been redirected to the East Drawing Room, she said. Dorian is with him. He is very angry, but he is contained. She paused. The guests are dispersing. I have told the staff to begin serving refreshments in the main hall, which will give everyone somewhere to go, and something to do while they process what they have just witnessed. Thank you, Petra, Roland said. Do not thank me yet, she said. Lord Galton is going to want a formal conversation. He is going to want it today. And he is going to want an explanation that addresses the contracts. She looked at her brother with the directness that only sisters achieve. You have created a significant legal and social situation, Roland. I know. Are you prepared to manage it? Yes. Petra held his gaze for another moment. Then something in her expression softened, just slightly, the way it does when someone who has been worried for a very long time allows themselves to stop worrying. She looked at Corabel, and the softening became something warmer. I told him once, Petra said to Corabel quietly, that he only smiles properly when you are in the room. You told me that too, Corabel said. I told both of you, Petra said, and neither of you did anything about it for 8 months, which I found extremely frustrating. She looked back at her brother. Or sort out Lord Galton, sort out the contracts, and then for the love of everything, say whatever it is you have not been saying for 3 years and say it properly. She turned and went back inside. The door clicked shut. Roland looked at Corabel. She is not wrong, he said. She is almost never wrong, Corabel agreed. He took a step toward her. Not the distance-closing rush of someone who had decided everything was resolved, but the careful, deliberate step of someone asking permission with movement rather than words. She did not step back. I love you, he said. Simply, directly, without the hedging and qualification that 3 years of fear had built up around it. I have loved you since you sat in a hallway chair outside my study for 2 hours with a book you were not reading, and I did not know what to do with it. And then I knew exactly what to do with it, and I was too frightened to do it. And I am done being frightened. Corabel looked at him. The cold air was sharp around them. The noise from inside the manor had settled into something distant and manageable. The winter sky above the courtyard was the pale, flat white of a day that had not decided yet what it was going to become. I love you too, she said. I have loved you for 3 years, and it has been the most inconvenient thing that has ever happened to me. Roland made a sound that was almost a laugh. It reached his eyes. I would like to spend a considerable amount of time making it less inconvenient. You have a great deal of work to do first, she said. I know, he said. Lord Galton, the contracts, the guests, of the Marchioness of Trenthorn's inevitable letter. And Prudence, Corabel said. You said there was something I did not know about Prudence. Roland's expression shifted again into something more careful. Yes, he said. There is. And it is going to change how you understand everything that happened today. The east drawing room was warm and full of tension. Lord Galton was seated in the largest chair, which he had clearly chosen on purpose, his considerable frame filling it entirely, his face still holding the particular red of a man whose fury had moved past its peak and settled into something colder and more deliberate. He had a glass of brandy in his hand that Dorian had evidently provided, which was either a peace offering or a strategy to keep Lord Galton's hands occupied. Probably both. But Dorian himself was standing near the window with his arms loosely folded, wearing the expression of a man who had navigated more difficult rooms than this one, and fully expected to navigate this one too. Prudence was seated apart from her father. This was the first thing Corabel noticed when Roland brought her into the room. Not beside him. Not close to him. She had chosen a chair near the far end of the room, near the second window, and she was sitting in it with a stillness that was different from the stillness of distress. It was the stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not expect to arrive, and is quietly deciding how to feel about it. She looked up when they entered. Her eyes moved from Roland to Corabel and back to Roland, and the expression on her face was, again, not the one Corabel expected. There was no anger in it. There was something more complicated, and more honest than anger. Lord Galton rose from his chair. "Ashburn," he said, in the voice that had spent 40 years being obeyed, "you are going to explain yourself. You are going to explain yourself fully, and then you are going to tell me how you intend to address the legal terms of our agreement, and then we are going to discuss what reparation looks like for what you have done to my family's reputation today." Roland met his gaze without flinching. "You are right on all 3 points," he said. "I owe you an explanation. I owe you a conversation about the contracts, and I owe you a genuine accounting of the damage today has caused your family. I am prepared to have all 3 conversations." Lord Galton blinked. He had been prepared for a fight. Roland's calm agreement had briefly disarmed him. "Good," he said, and sat back down. Roland looked at Prudence. Something passed between them that Corabel could not fully read. Not an apology exactly. Something older than apology. The look of 2 people who had a conversation before today that the rest of the room did not know about. "Tell her," Prudence said quietly. It was the first thing she had said since Corabel had entered the room. Roland nodded. He looked at Corabel. 3 months ago, he said, when Prudence came to Ashburn for the formal introduction, we had a conversation that didn't take place in front of anyone else. It took place in the library, after supper, while everyone else had gone to bed. Corabel remembered that evening. She had gone to bed early herself, unable to watch Roland and Prudence move through the drawing room together with the careful courtesy of 2 people performing an arrangement. "Prudence told me," Roland continued, "that she was aware the marriage was a contractual alliance rather than a personal one. She told me she understood that her father had negotiated it primarily for the political connections it would bring to the Galton family. And she told me something else." He paused. Prudence, from her chair near the window, said, "You may tell her, Roland. It is not a secret I need to keep any longer." Roland looked at Corabel steadily. "Prudence is in love with someone else. It has been 2 years. A man her father does not approve of. A man without title or significant fortune, which is the entirety of the reason Lord Galton arranged this marriage in the first place, to give Prudence an establishment grand enough that she would have no reason to keep looking in that direction." The room went very quiet. Lord Galton's jaw had tightened. He did not deny it. "She told me," Roland said, "that she would fulfill the marriage, if that was what was required of her. But she asked me if I had any feeling of my own that pointed elsewhere, to consider whether we were both making a mistake." Corabel looked at Prudence. Prudence looked back at her with clear eyes and a composure that had a different quality to it, now that Corabel understood what was underneath it. "I did not tell him to stop the wedding," Prudence said, addressing Corabel directly for the first time. "I want to be clear about that. I told him the truth about my own situation and left the decision entirely to him. What he chose today was his own." "Why are you telling me this?" Corabel asked. "Because you deserve to understand it," Prudence said simply. "You spent 3 years in this house, loving him quietly and asking nothing of him. The least you deserve is the full truth of how today came to happen." Lord Galton made a sound of profound displeasure. "This is not a conversation I agreed to have," he said to his daughter. "No," Prudence said to her father, with a gentleness that was also entirely firm. "But it is one I am choosing to have. And I think, father, that we both know this marriage was never going to make either of us happy. Not Roland, not me, and certainly not the person you have been trying to prevent me from thinking about for 2 years." Lord Galton looked at his daughter for a long moment. if the fury in his face did something complicated, it did not disappear. But it shifted, the way the expression of a man shifts when he is confronted with the face of someone he loves more than he loves his plans, and has to decide, in real time, which matters more. He looked away. He drank his brandy. He said nothing. Dorian, near the window, had the good judgment to stay completely silent. Roland turned to Lord Galton. "The contracts," he said. "I will honor the financial terms in full. Every settlement agreed upon will be paid. I will not allow the Galton family to sustain a material loss from what happened today. I will also, if it would be useful, or to write formally to whomever you require, confirming that the dissolution of this arrangement was my decision alone, and that Lady Prudence bears no fault or responsibility." Lord Galton was quiet for a moment. Then he said, roughly, "That is more than I expected." "It is the least you are owed," Roland said. Another silence. Then Lord Galton looked at his daughter. Something moved across his face that was not quite surrender, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who has held a position for a long time and is beginning, slowly, to understand the cost of holding it. "Who is he?" Lord Galton asked his daughter. His voice was different now, quieter. Prudence looked at her father. For the first time since Corabel had entered the room, something in Prudence's composure softened into something real and unguarded. "No, his name is Thomas Aldwell," she said. "He is a physician. He is kind and serious, and he makes me laugh. And I have loved him for 2 years, and I have been trying very hard not to." Lord Galton closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, he looked older than he had 10 minutes ago. "A physician," he said, without the contempt Corabel expected. Just the word. Sitting there. "Yes," Prudence said. Lord Galton drank the rest of his brandy. He set the glass down. He looked at the floor for a long moment, and then he looked at Roland, and he said, with the effortful dignity of a man putting down something very heavy, "See that the financial settlement is handled quietly and promptly." "You have my word," Roland said. Lord Galton stood. He crossed the room to his daughter, stopped in front of her, and looked at her for a moment with an expression that Corabel felt she should not be watching. Too private, too much the interior of a relationship she had no part in. Then he said gruffly, "I suppose a physician is at least useful." Prudence's composure broke, just barely, just at the edges. She stood and put her arms around her father, and Lord Galton, after a very brief pause, put one large arm around his daughter and held her. Dorian caught Corabel's eye from across the room. He tilted his head very slightly toward the door. She understood. She touched Roland's arm quietly. He looked at her, then at the room, then nodded, and the three of them withdrew, leaving Lord Galton and Prudence to the privacy of a conversation that had been waiting far longer than today. The corridor outside was cool and quiet, while Dorian pulled the door closed softly behind them, and then leaned against the wall and let out a long breath that suggested he had been holding it for some time. "Well," he said, to no one in particular. "Thank you," Roland said, "for managing Lord Galton." "I did very little managing," Dorian said. "Mostly I gave him brandy and stood between him and the door." He glanced at Corabel. "How are you?" "I genuinely do not know," she said honestly. He nodded, as though that was a completely reasonable answer. "The guests have mostly gone," he said. "Petra has handled the hall. The Marchioness of Trenthorn left 20 minutes ago, which means her letter will arrive within the week." "I will deal with the letter," Roland said. "You will deal with a great many things," Dorian said. He looked at his friend with an expression that held a long and layered history. Are you all right?" "More than I have in 3 years," Roland said. Dorian looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Corabel. Then he straightened up from the wall and said, "Good. Then I'm going to find something to eat, because it is past noon, and I have been managing a catastrophe on an empty stomach, and you two clearly need 10 minutes alone." He walked off down the corridor with the unhurried stride of a man who had earned his lunch. Roland and Corabel stood in the quiet hallway. The house around them had settled into the particular stillness that follows a large event, all the energy of preparation and anticipation replaced by the different, heavier quiet of the aftermath. Roland turned to look at her. "I know this is not how you imagined today ending." "I did not imagine today ending at all," she said. "I imagined leaving." "I know." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture so quiet and careful that it undid something she had been keeping very tightly held. "I am going to spend a considerable amount of time making sure you never feel the need to leave again." "You said that already," she said softly. "I know," he said. "I intend to keep saying it until it stops being necessary and starts being simply true." She looked at him. The winter light from the corridor window was falling across his face in a way that made him look younger and more uncertain than the Duke of Ashvern was generally allowed to appear in public, and she thought that this particular version of him, unguarded and honest, and a little frightened and entirely present, was the one she had loved from the very beginning. "There is still a great deal to sort out," she said. "There is," he agreed. "The estate, the staff, the gossip that is already spreading across London as we stand here. All of it," he said. "And your intentions need to be made formal," she said, meeting his eyes steadily. "Whatever comes next, it needs to be done properly. I will not be a secret or an arrangement or a quiet understanding. If you mean what you said in that courtyard, it needs to mean it in front of the same people who watched you walk away from that altar." Roland held her gaze. "I would not have it any other way," he said. "I walked away from that altar in front of 300 people, and I intend to walk toward you in front of just as many." The corridor was very quiet. Outside, somewhere in the grounds, a bird was calling in the frozen winter garden. "All right," Corabel said. "All right," Roland repeated. And somewhere in the east drawing room, a father was slowly, reluctantly, with the painful grace of a man learning something new about love, letting go of a plan he had held for 2 years, and perhaps beginning, in the quiet of that warm room, to make space for something better. The days that followed the wedding that never was moved through Ashvern Manor like weather. Some of it was cold and sharp, some of it was unexpectedly still, and some of it, in the quiet corners of the house where only Corabel noticed, was beginning, very slowly, to feel like the first warmth of something new. The letters arrived first. They came in a flood, the morning after, stacked on Roland's desk in the study by his secretary, Mr. Fenwick, a thin and quietly efficient man of 50, who had worked for the Ashvern estate for 23 years, and had developed, over that time, the ability to deliver any news with exactly the same unruffled expression, regardless of what the news actually was. He set the letters down, noted that there were 47 of them, mentioned that 3 were from members of Parliament, 1 was from a bishop, and 1 appeared to be from the Marchioness of Trenthorn, and had been sealed with enough wax to suggest considerable feeling behind it, and then he withdrew without comment. Roland stood at his desk and looked at the stack. Corabel was in the chair by the window, or the one she had always used when she came to the study to read while he worked, and she watched him look at the letters with the particular expression of a man who has made a decision he doesn't regret, and is simply now calculating the full price of it. "Do you want to read them?" she asked. "Not especially," he said. "But I am going to." He sat down and began. Corabel watched him work through the first 10. His expression did not change significantly. There was a slight tightening around the eyes for 2 of them, a brief pause at a third, and then he set that one aside and moved to the next. "What does the bishop say?" she asked. Roland glanced up. "That he is praying for wisdom to prevail." A pause. "He does not specify whose wisdom." "And the Marchioness?" Roland picked up the heavily sealed letter, turned it over once, and set it back down. "I will read that one last," he said, "as a reward for getting through the others." Despite everything, Corabel smiled. He saw it. The expression that crossed his face when he did was the one she had been cataloguing for 3 years, without letting herself name it. And now she could name it, and it was almost dizzying to do so openly, without immediately looking away. Lady Petra came in at 10:30 without knocking, which was entirely in keeping with her general approach to doors. She was carrying a notebook and wearing the expression of someone who had already been awake for 4 hours and had opinions about everything. "I have made a list," she announced. "Of course you have," Roland said. "The most immediate concerns are the formal dissolution of the Galton arrangement, which needs to be handled through the family solicitors before the end of the week. The public statement, which needs to be drafted today and sent to the appropriate people before the gossip columns decide to draft one for you. The staff, who need to be spoken to directly so they hear the correct version of events before the incorrect version reaches them from outside. And Corabel's situation, which needs to be addressed." She said the last item with the directness of someone who had been thinking about it since yesterday and was not going to pretend otherwise. Both Roland and Corabel looked at her. "Her position in this house?" Petra said, setting the notebook on the edge of the desk. "She arrived as Mother's companion. Mother is gone. That role no longer formally exists, which means that as of this morning, Corabel's presence here is socially ambiguous, and you know as well as I do that ambiguity is the one thing we cannot afford to be right now, when every person in London is already constructing their own version of what happened in that chapel." Roland looked at Corabel. Corabel looked back at him with the steady gaze of a woman who had thought about this herself already, had been thinking about it since she woke up this morning, and was not going to pretend she had not. "Petra is right," Corabel said. "I know she is," Roland said. "Which means you need to act quickly," Petra said, closing her notebook with the satisfied efficiency of someone who has made her point and does not need to belabor it. And correctly, and in a way that leaves absolutely no room for the interpretation that Corabel is anything other than exactly what she is, which is the woman you chose, clearly and publicly, over every other consideration. She looked at her brother steadily. "Do you understand what I am telling you, Roland?" "I understand completely," he said. "Good." Petra picked up her notebook. "I will send for the solicitor." She walked to the door and then stopped, turned back, and said to Corabel, with warmth that she did not usually let show so plainly, "I am very glad you did not get in that carriage." She left. The study was quiet again. Roland set down the letter he had been holding and looked at Corabel with the expression she was learning to read as him making a decision that he had already made some time ago and was only now preparing to execute. "I am going to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to hear it clearly, or without the noise of yesterday around it." "All right," she said. He stood up from the desk, He came around it and crossed the room to where she was sitting and crouched down in front of her chair so that they were at eye level. And the gesture was so entirely without performance, so stripped of the formal distance that rank and position usually kept between them, that her breath caught. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for 3 years, and I was afraid, and I was wrong to be afraid. And I cost us both a great deal of time that I intend to spend the rest of my life accounting for." He paused. "I would very much like to marry you, Cora Bell. Not quickly, not quietly, not in a way that looks like a correction or a consolation. Properly, with a formal courtship and the full knowledge of everyone who matters and a ceremony that you deserve, in a chapel that is full of people who are there because they are happy for us, and not because they are satisfying a social obligation." Cora Bell looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the winter garden was very still. The sky had cleared overnight, and the light coming in was pale and clean and honest. "You have 47 letters on your desk," she said. "I do. And a bishop praying for wisdom, apparently, and the Marchioness of Trenthorn, whom I have not read yet and am not afraid of." She looked at his face, the serious, dark-eyed, deeply feeling face of a man who had spent 3 years being afraid of the wrong things and had finally, at considerable public expense, stopped. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Yes, Roland, I will marry you." Something moved across his face that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was the particular expression of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has just been allowed to breathe. He reached up and took her hand. He pressed it briefly against his face, eyes closed just for a moment, and then he looked at her and said, "Thank you." "Do not thank me," she said softly. "I have wanted to say yes for 3 years. The thanks go in the other direction." He stood. He pulled her gently to her feet, and for the first time, in the quiet of the study with the winter light coming through the window, and 47 letters on the desk, and a great deal of complicated work still ahead of them, he held her properly, his arms around her, and her face against his shoulder. And they stood there for a long moment without saying anything at all. They did not need to. 3 years of careful distance, 3 years of almost, 3 years of the space between what they felt and what they were allowed to say. And now the space was gone, and it turned out that without it, they fit together with the simple, solid certainty of 2 things that had always been meant to occupy the same place. The day moved forward. The solicitor arrived at noon and spent 2 hours with Roland reviewing the terms of the Galton dissolution. The financial settlement was substantial but manageable. The formal paperwork would take a week to complete. Roland's statement was drafted by mid-afternoon, reviewed by Petra, adjusted twice by Dorian, who arrived unannounced at 2 o'clock, claiming he had been in the area, which was not true. They had sent out before the evening post. The statement was simple, direct, and left very little room for interpretation. It acknowledged that the ceremony had not been completed, confirmed that the dissolution of the arrangement was entirely Roland's decision, affirmed that Lady Prudence Galton bore no fault, and stated plainly and without elaboration that the Duke of Ashford intended to begin a formal courtship of Lady Cora Bell Ashton with the full intention of marriage. Dorian read the final version and said, "That is either going to settle things very quickly or make them considerably worse." "Which do you think?" Roland asked. "Both," Dorian said. "In that order." He was right. By the following morning, the responses had begun to arrive. Some were cold, several were pointed, or 2 were genuinely offensive and were fed directly into the fireplace by Petra, who did not bother telling Roland they had arrived. But a surprising number, more than Corabel had expected, were something else entirely. Warm. Curious. A few were even admiring, in the careful way that society admires something it finds scandalous, but secretly finds romantic. Lady Dunwall wrote that she had always found the original Galton arrangement rather cold, and was delighted to hear that feeling had prevailed. Countess Fairbridge, who had travelled from Edinburgh for the wedding, and had therefore witnessed the entire event firsthand, wrote that she had seen something in Roland's face during the ceremony that had told her exactly what was coming, and she had thought it was about time. Baron Selwick's young wife sent a note that said only, "I knew it. My husband owes me £10. Corabel read that 3 times, and then set it down, and laughed, properly and freely, for the first time in longer than she could remember. Roland, who was standing across the room, reading his own correspondence, looked up at the sound. He watched her laugh with an expression that said very clearly that he intended to spend a significant portion of the rest of his life causing that particular sound. But not every letter was warm, and not every problem resolved itself quietly. On the 4th day after the wedding, Lord Cavendish arrived at Ashfern without an invitation. He was a man of 60, heavy-browed and deliberate, one of the senior figures of the political circle that Roland moved in through his Parliament obligations. He and Roland's father had been close. He had known Roland since Roland was 12 years old, and he arrived in the morning room with the specific gravity of a man who had decided he was owed a conversation. Corabel was in the room when he arrived. She did not leave. Roland did not ask her to. Lord Cavendish looked at her when he entered, assessed the situation in the single second that experienced men use to assess situations, and then sat down across from Roland with the expression of a man about to say something he had rehearsed. "I am not here to condemn you," he said to Roland. "I want you to understand that before I say anything else." "I appreciate that," Roland said. "What you did was extraordinary," Cavendish said. "And I mean that in the original sense of the word, outside the ordinary. It will be talked about for years, possibly decades." He paused. "But what I want to know, and I am asking because I knew your father and I have known you for 20 years, is whether you have thought through what you are building. Not what you are leaving behind. What you are building." Roland looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said. "More clearly than I have thought about anything." Cavendish looked at Corabel. "Lady Corabel," he said, addressing her directly, "I will ask you the same question. Not because I doubt your feelings, because I respect it enough to ask. Are you prepared for what this life requires? The scrutiny, the expectation, the weight of a title and an estate, and a public life that will evaluate you without mercy, particularly because of how you came to it." Corabel met his gaze without hesitation. "Lord Cavendish," she said, "well, I spent 3 years in this house, managing a grief-stricken duke, a dying duchess, an estate in political transition, and my own feelings in complete silence. I believe I am adequately prepared." Cavendish looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Roland. Then he said, "Good," and reached for the tea that had been set on the table beside him. The rest of the conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered 3 topics of Parliament business that Roland needed to attend to. A question about the Northfield drainage that had nothing to do with anything personal, and a brief discussion of the upcoming season in London. When Cavendish left, he shook Roland's hand with both of his own, which was not something he did often, and nodded to Corabel with the particular nod that means more than it appears to. Roland closed the door behind him and turned to Corabel. "You were extraordinary," he said. "I was honest," she said. "It is easier." "Not for everyone," he said. She looked at him. "For us," she said. From now on, we are going to be honest with each other. No more silence. No more held back things. Almost no more. Almost. Agreed, he said, without hesitation. I mean it, Roland. So do I. He crossed the room and stood in front of her, and looked at her with those dark eyes that held everything he felt, and no longer made any effort to hide it. No more, almost, he said. Only entirely. Spring came to Ashverne in the way spring always came to old estates, gradually and then suddenly, the frozen garden thawing inch by inch, until one morning Corabel looked out of the library window and realized that everything was green, and 4 months had passed since the wedding that had not happened. It had been 4 months of considerable work and occasional difficulty, and more than one uncomfortable evening navigating the particular social landscape of a society that was still deciding how it felt about everything. But they had also been 4 months of something else, something that moved underneath all of it like a current, steady and warm and increasingly certain. The formal courtship had been conducted properly, as Roland had promised. Calls made and received, evenings attended, the correct letters written to the correct people. Corabel's father, Baron Ashton, had been brought to Ashverne in the 2nd week of January for a conversation with Roland that lasted 3 hours and ended with the Baron shaking Roland's hand with an expression that suggested he had a great many feelings about the situation and had chosen to organize them into approval. Her aunt in Bath, to whom Corabel had written on the morning of the wedding with the letter that said she was coming, received a second letter 3 days later explaining that she was not. Her aunt wrote back a reply of 4 pages that contained, in its final paragraph, the sentence, "I always thought it would come to this, and I am delighted to have been right." Dorian Carew had remained a constant and comfortable presence throughout, was appearing at Ashverne with the irregular reliability of someone who had decided that he was invested in the outcome and intended to see it through. He and Petra had developed, over the course of these 4 months, a dynamic that Corabel found fascinating, and Roland found either amusing or alarming, depending on the day. They argued constantly about everything. Books, politics, the correct way to manage an estate, the question of whether the East Garden should be replanted in spring. The arguments were sharp and quick, and full of the particular energy of 2 people who are genuinely well matched, and both know it and are choosing not to acknowledge it yet. Corabel mentioned this to Roland one evening in late February. He looked unsurprised. "Dorian has been in love with my sister for approximately 4 years, he said, and Corabel stared at him. "And you have said nothing?" "It was not my thing to say," Roland said mildly. "I learned recently the cost of leaving important things unsaid. I am hoping Dorian reaches the same conclusion independently before much longer." Corabel looked at him. "You could simply tell him." "I could," Roland agreed. "But watching him argue with Petra about the East Garden is one of the genuine pleasures of my current life, and I am not quite ready to sacrifice it." She laughed. He looked pleased with himself in the quiet way he always looked pleased with himself when he made her laugh. It was a habit she was becoming deeply fond of. Prudence Galton had written once, 6 weeks after the dissolution. The letter was brief and warm, and written in the hand of a person who was doing better than expected. She said that her father had made inquiries about Thomas Aldwell, that the inquiries had gone better than anticipated, and that there had been a dinner at the Galton House in London at which Thomas had been present, and which had not ended in disaster. She said she was grateful for what had happened in the chapel, even though she understood it had not been done for her sake. She said she hoped Corabel would be very happy. Corabel wrote back. The correspondence had continued, quietly and without expectation, into something that felt like the beginning of a genuine friendship between two women who had both, in their different ways, been trying to find their way to where they were supposed to be. Lord Galton had not written, but Roland had received word through the solicitors that the financial settlement had been accepted in full, or the paperwork was complete, and the matter was considered closed. It was the closest thing to forgiveness that the situation was likely to produce in the short term, and Roland took it as such. The Marchioness of Trenthorn's letter, which Roland had finally read on the evening of the wedding day, had contained 3 pages of very precisely worded disapproval, followed by a single paragraph at the end that said she had known Roland's grandmother, and that his grandmother had also done something extraordinary for love, and had never regretted it, and that the Marchioness supposed some things ran in families. It was, in its way, a blessing. Roland had read that final paragraph to Corabel, and they had sat quietly with it for a moment, before deciding it was the best thing the Marchioness had ever said. Now it is spring, and today was different from every other day of the past 4 months. The chapel had been cleaned and filled with flowers again. Not the white and cream and gold of a formal winter wedding, but something lighter and more alive. The colors of a garden at the beginning of its best season. The same tall windows let in light, but it was warmer now, softer. The kind of light that makes stone walls look less severe and people look like the best versions of themselves. The guests were different, too. Not 300 this time. Roland had been clear about that. This was not a performance, or a political event, or a social obligation. The people in these pews were the people who had earned the right to be there, who had navigated the past 4 months with genuine goodwill and honest feeling. Lady Petra sat in the front row. She was wearing an expression of profound satisfaction that she was making no effort whatsoever to conceal. Beside her, because he had positioned himself there before anyone could suggest otherwise, sat Dorian Carew, who was looking at the altar with the expression of a man quietly reckoning with several things at once. Baron Ashton sat in the second row with his wife, Corabel's mother, a small and perceptive woman who had cried 3 times already, and the ceremony had not yet begun. Beside them sat Corabel's younger brother, Lieutenant Ashton, who had come up from his regiment specifically for this day, and who had spent the previous evening in deep conversation with Roland that had ended with the 2 of them shaking hands with considerable warmth. Mr. Fenwick, Roland's secretary, sat near the back with the same unruffled expression he brought to all occasions, but he had, Corabel noticed, chosen to sit in the front half of the back section rather than the very back, which she chose to interpret as enthusiasm. Lord Cavendish was there. He had arrived early, which was not his habit, and he had spoken briefly to Corabel before she went to prepare, and he had said only, "Your answer to my question in the morning room 4 months ago was the best answer I have heard in 40 years of listening to people answer questions. I wanted you to know that." Even Countess Fairbridge had come back from Edinburgh. When Roland learned she intended to attend, he had said that he respected a woman who was committed to seeing things through to their proper ending. The organ began. Corabel stood at the back of the chapel with her father beside her, and her hand on his arm, and the whole of the rest of her life arranged in front of her like a room she had been waiting to walk into for 3 years. Her father looked at her. "Ready?" he said, in the simple way fathers ask that question when they mean something much larger than the word. "Yes," she said, and meant it without reservation. They began to walk. Roland was standing at the altar. He was not looking at the floor. He was not looking at the priest or the guests or the flowers or the winter-turned spring light coming through the tall windows. He was looking at her, the way he had looked at her, across a crowded chapel 4 months ago, except that now there was nothing between them, no distance to cross, No 300 strangers. No bride standing beside him. No packed trunk, no waiting carriage. Just the aisle and the light and his face and the expression on it that she had been reading and finally allowing herself to understand for the past 4 months. It was the expression of a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. She reached the altar. Her father placed her hand in Roland's. Roland's fingers closed around hers, firm and certain, in exactly the way they had in the pew 4 months ago, except that this time no one in the chapel was shocked. This time every person in the room was exactly as glad as the occasion required them to be. The priest opened his book. He smiled just slightly before he began. He had been present 4 months ago. He had a sense of how far this had travelled to arrive here. "We are gathered," he said, "in the sight of God and in the company of those who love them both." Corabel looked at Roland. Roland looked at Corabel. The priest spoke the words that had been waiting, patient as stones, for this exact moment to mean exactly what they were supposed to mean. When they reached the declaration, no one in the chapel held their breath the way they had 4 months ago. There was no suspended collective tension, no leaning forward, no wondering. Everyone knew what was coming. Roland said it clearly, without hesitation, without fear. The way a man speaks when he is saying something he has known for years and is only now being given the correct occasion to say aloud. Corabel said it back, and when the priest closed his book and nodded, and Roland leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead before he kissed her, which was such an entirely Roland thing to do, to offer something tender before something decisive, that Corabel felt her eyes fill for the first time all day. The chapel responded with the particular warmth of a room full of people who are genuinely, unreservedly, completely happy. Petra was crying. She would deny this later with considerable energy, but it was absolutely true, and Dorian, seated beside her, handed her his handkerchief with the practiced ease of someone who had brought it specifically for this purpose, which meant he had predicted it, which meant he had been paying attention to her for a long time, which meant that Roland was right, and the East Garden conversation was only going to continue for so much longer before something else had to happen. Baron Ashton was gripping his wife's hand. Countess Fairbridge was nodding with the satisfaction of someone who has made a long journey and found it entirely worth it. Lord Cavendish, near the front, looked at the altar with the expression of a man thinking about a grandmother and a family that had run certain things for a very long time, and how it was sometimes deeply correct for things to stay true across generations. Lieutenant Ashton was not crying. He was, however, staring very fixedly at the flowers, which was the military man's version of crying. Dorian was watching Petra from the side, with the careful attention of someone who had been watching something for a long time, and was beginning to think about what came next. And at the altar, the two people who had found their way through 3 years of silence, and 1 very public catastrophe, and 4 months of careful, patient rebuilding stood together in the spring light of a chapel that smelled of new flowers and old stone, and everything that was finally, completely, undeniably right. Roland held Corabel's hand. She held his back. The priest said the final words. The organ began again, warmer this time, fuller, the music of a beginning rather than a ceremony. The chapel doors opened, and the spring air came in, carrying the smell of the East Garden and the season that had just arrived, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days that were waiting, patient and full and entirely theirs on the other side of this threshold. They walked out together, not away from anything, toward everything. Behind them, the chapel filled with the sound of people rising to their feet, and Petra finally stopped pretending she was not crying. Then Dorian looked at her, and made a decision that the East Garden argument could wait perhaps one more week, but not much longer. And Lord Cavendish thought about a grandmother who had also done something extraordinary for love, and had never regretted it. And outside, in the spring morning, the Duke and the woman he had chosen, clearly and publicly, and without any remaining doubt, stepped into the light of a day that was all beginning and no ending at all. And somewhere, in the east drawing-room of a London townhouse, a woman named Prudence was sitting across a dinner table from a quiet and serious physician named Thomas Aldwell, and she was laughing at something he had said, and her father was watching from the other end of the table with the expression of a man slowly and genuinely learning the difference between a plan and a life. And at Ashburn, in the garden that was just turning green again, two people who had taken the longest possible route to the most obvious destination were finally, completely, entirely home. If you have stayed with this story from the chapel to the garden, from the stopped wedding to the right one, then you already know what it feels like to believe in second chances and honest love and the kind of courage it takes to say the true thing out loud. Tell us in the comments, what was the moment in this story that stayed with you the most? Was it when Roland said stop, or when Cora Belle said not quite, or something else entirely? Drop your answer below. Tell us where you are watching from. And if this story moved something in you, please hit the subscribe button right now, because there are more stories like this one waiting, and you do not want to miss a single one.